Desmond Vaughn was 41 years old the afternoon his wife stood in the lobby of First Carolina Heritage Bank and called him broke in front of 3 tellers, 2 loan officers, and a security guard who had to look away to keep from laughing. She did not know the security guard had been hired by Desmond personally 6 years earlier. She did not know 2 of the tellers had been to his Christmas party. She did not know the building she was standing in, the marble floors she was clicking across in her new heels, the brass nameplate behind the desk that read First Carolina Heritage, EST, 2014. All of it traced back through a chain of holding companies to a single signature on a single piece of paper. And that signature was her husband's. She did not know any of it, because she had stopped asking him questions about his work 3 years into their marriage, somewhere around the time she decided she had married beneath her station. He was standing in the lobby in a navy work jacket and clean jeans, because he had come straight from a job site in Greenville, where he had been pretending, as he had pretended for 7 of their 9 years of marriage, to be a mid-level operations manager for a regional commercial real estate firm. The firm was real. He did manage operations. He also owned it, along with the bank that financed half of its deals, along with 2 other small community banks in eastern North Carolina that nobody at this particular branch knew about. He had been at the job site that morning because a young foreman he was mentoring had asked him to walk a slab pour. And Desmond was the kind of man who showed up when a young foreman asked. His wife Brielle had walked into the lobby 20 minutes earlier without knowing he was there. She had come to submit a personal loan application for $48,000. She had told Desmond it was for a small investment opportunity with her friend Tasha. The investment opportunity, as Desmond had quietly confirmed 3 weeks earlier through a colleague at a competing bank, was a down payment on a condominium in Wilmington that Brielle planned to share with a man named Carlton Royce, age 39, a fitness influencer with a 6-year tax lien and a habit of dating women whose husbands had savings accounts. Desmond had been standing by the conference room doorway watching her fill out the form when she had looked up and seen him, and her face had done something complicated for 2 full seconds before she settled on annoyance. "What are you doing here?" she had said, not as a question. "I told you I was running errands." And then, because 2 of the loan officers were watching, and because Brielle Vaughn had never in her life been able to resist an audience, she had laughed and said, loud enough for the lobby to hear, "Don't worry, baby, you don't need to come bail me out. We both know you're broke. Just go wait in the truck." The lobby got quiet the way a forest gets quiet before something happens. What Brielle had never thought to ask, not once in 9 years of marriage, was why the man she called broke had a private banker on speed dial, or why the loan application she was about to submit would land on a desk 3 floors above her head before the end of the business day, or why the man whose loan she was about to be approved for had been preparing for this exact afternoon for 14 months. $312,000 had moved through their joint accounts during that time, in patterns Desmond had been tracking the way a banker tracks a slow run. She had no idea North Carolina law and a post-nuptial agreement she had signed without reading were about to take back every dollar. He looked at his wife across the lobby, and he did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in 9 years. He smiled, just slightly, the way his grandmother used to smile right before she said something a person would remember for the rest of their natural life. Then, he walked past her toward the elevator, and he nodded once to the senior loan officer at the back desk, and he said quietly, "Sarah, go ahead and process Mrs. Vaughn's application. Send it up to me personally. I'll handle the approval." Sarah, who had worked for Desmond for 5 years, did not blink. "Yes, sir," she said. Brielle's face changed in stages he would remember for a long time. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in low and gold through the kitchen windows of the modest brick ranch Desmond Vaughn kept on a quiet street in New Bern, North Carolina. The coffee was already brewing. He stood at the counter in a flannel shirt and work jeans, watching a pair of mourning doves work the feeder he had built from cedar scraps left over from a deck job in Havelock 3 winters earlier. The house was small. It was older than him. He had bought it in cash 11 years before he ever met Brielle, and he had never moved out of it, and that fact alone should have told her something she had never bothered to learn. He poured his coffee black into a heavy ceramic mug his grandmother had given him at his college graduation. The mug had a hairline crack along the handle from the day he had carried it through a move in 2009, and he had never replaced it. His grandmother had said something to him the spring he graduated, sitting at her own kitchen table in Kinston with her Bible open and her reading glasses pushed up on her head. "Baby," she had said, "money is the loudest thing a quiet man can carry. The trick is to set it down before you walk into a room. Let people meet the man first. The money will introduce itself later, and only if it has to." She had been dead now for 5 years. He still heard her on certain mornings, the way a man hears a song he learned as a child. Desmond Vaughn did not look like a wealthy man, and that was the whole point. He had built First Carolina Heritage Bank over the course of 9 years, starting from a small commercial lending shop he had bought out of an estate sale in 2014 for a sum he had assembled from a sold piece of family land in Lenoir County, and a careful decade of patient saving. He had grown it the way his grandmother grew her tomatoes, slowly, on purpose, without bragging about it. Heritage now held just under $400 million in assets. He had added 2 smaller community banks to the holding structure in 2019 and 2022. He owned a commercial real estate operations firm on the side, Vaughn Coastal Partners, because his grandmother had also said, "Never let your money sit still without giving it a job." He did not own a sports car. He drove a 2017 Ford F-150 with 188,000 miles on it. He liked the truck. Only 3 people in his life knew the full picture. His Uncle Garrett, who had been a community banker in Wilson for 40 years before he retired, and who served as Desmond's quiet counsel. His attorney Phyllis Mott in Raleigh, who had drafted every entity document Desmond had ever signed, and his executive assistant Yvonne Pruitt, who had been with him since the 2nd year of Heritage, and who guarded his calendar with the focused suspicion of a woman raised by a Pentecostal grandmother. Brielle did not know. Brielle had been told 8 years earlier that her husband worked operations for a commercial real estate firm in eastern North Carolina, and she had filed that information away and never asked a follow-up question. He had met her at a wedding in Morehead City the year he turned 32. She had been a bridesmaid. She had laughed at something he said about the band's lead singer, and she had asked him to dance, and she had asked him good questions for about 1.5 years after that. She had been kind in those days. She had brought a casserole to his uncle's house when his uncle had knee surgery. She had cried at his grandmother's funeral the way a daughter-in-law should cry. Whatever she became later, she had not been that woman in the beginning, and he had carried the memory of who she had been like a stone in his pocket. Hoping for a long time that he would find her again, he had eventually accepted he would not. He carried his coffee out through the side door and into the small workshop he kept in the detached garage, the room with the workbench he had built from a single slab of pecan salvaged from a hurricane-felled tree on his cousin's land in Pamlico County. On the bench sat the chair he had been refinishing for 3 Sundays, a ladderback his grandmother had owned, the one she had sat in every morning while she read her Bible. Above the bench, on a small shelf at eye level, sat a black plastic box the size of a paperback book. The box was a discrete audio module he had wired into the kitchen pendant fixture 18 months earlier, on a weekend project Brielle had not bothered to ask about. The module did not record continuously. It activated on voice and stored to a server only he could access. He had not put it there in bad faith. He had put it there because his Uncle Garrett had said, the previous Christmas, "Son, something is moving in that house. I don't know what, but you put yourself in a position to know." Desmond had trusted his uncle for 38 years. He had trusted him on this. Brielle came into the kitchen in her silk robe and the perfume he had not bought her, the one that had started showing up on her clothes 14 months earlier. She kissed his cheek without looking at him. "What time will you be home tonight?" "Late," he said. "Driving down to Greenville." She poured herself coffee. "I might go to Tasha's later. We're working on a thing." "That sounds nice," he said. She did not notice he had stopped asking what the thing was 4 months ago. She walked back toward the bedroom, and he watched her go and noted, without comment, that her wedding ring had been in the dish on her dresser for 9 consecutive mornings. His phone buzzed. A text from Yvonne. "Loan application from a B. Vaughn submitted to the New Bern branch yesterday afternoon. $48,000. Listed purpose, personal investment. Routed to your queue for review per your standing instruction." He looked at it for a long moment. Then, he set the phone down. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He drove to the Greenville site that morning and walked the slab pour with the young foreman and stayed 2 hours longer than he needed to. He liked the young foreman. The young foreman reminded him of himself at 26. On the drive back, he called Phyllis Mott. "Phil," he said, "she filed it. Today's the day. I'm going to handle it in the lobby." Phyllis was quiet for a beat. "You sure?" "I'm sure," he said. "Quiet is the brand, but quiet doesn't mean blind." Phyllis said she would have the petition ready to file by Tuesday morning. "And Desmond," she added, "be a banker in that lobby. Not a husband. There's a difference today." He pulled into the bank parking lot at 2:48 p.m. He had not changed clothes. The denim jacket and the work boots were the costume. He had worn the costume for 9 years. He was wearing it one last time on purpose. He walked into the lobby, and his wife saw him and made the joke. The lobby got quiet. He told Sarah to send the application upstairs. Brielle's face did the thing he would remember. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor and sat down at his desk, and Yvonne brought him the file 12 minutes later without saying a word. She set it down and turned and closed the door behind her on the way out. Desmond opened the folder and read every page. The application was sloppy. Brielle had listed her income at a figure roughly 40% higher than her actual pay stubs from the dental office where she worked part-time. She had listed her assets to include the brick ranch on Walnut Street, which was not in her name and had never been in her name. She had listed the joint checking account at a balance that had been true 6 months ago and was not true now because Desmond had quietly moved 70% of it into a separate account at his Uncle Garrett's old bank in Wilson. She had signed the form. She had attested to its accuracy under federal banking statute. She had committed, on paper, what a careful lawyer might describe as a small but documentable instance of loan application fraud. He picked up the phone. He called Sarah downstairs. "Sarah," he said, "approve the loan. Full amount. Standard terms. I want it dispersed by the end of business Friday." Sarah hesitated for half a second. "Sir, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Desmond said. "Approve it, disperse it, and send Mrs. Vaughn a congratulatory letter on bank letterhead, signed by me." He paused. "And Sarah, keep a copy of every page of that application in the secure file. Every single page." "Yes, sir," Sarah said. He hung up. He sat at his desk for a long time after that and watched the late afternoon light move across the parking lot. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the way she had told him, the summer he turned 15, that the worst thing a person could do to a quiet man was mistake his quiet for weakness. Because the quiet was where he kept his tools. He thought about how Brielle had spent 9 years assuming his quiet was a shortage. He thought about how she was about to learn what had actually been in the toolbox the whole time. 3 days passed. By Tuesday morning, Desmond was sitting across from Phyllis Mott in her corner office in Raleigh, with Yvonne to his left and his uncle Garrett to his right. Garrett was 71, white at the temples, a man who had spent 4 decades in community banking and who could read a balance sheet the way a preacher reads scripture. He had driven down from Wilson at 5 that morning. He had brought his own coffee and a thermos. He sipped it slowly, while Phyllis laid out the file. Brielle had signed a postnup in 2019, drafted by Phyllis. Executed on the second morning of an anniversary trip to St. Augustine, Desmond had handed it to her with the words "just some routine paperwork for the holding company," and she had signed it without reading because she was annoyed they were doing paperwork on vacation. The postnup carved Vaughn Coastal Partners and First Carolina Heritage and both of the smaller community banks entirely out of the marital estate. It included a fidelity clause that voided any spousal support claim in the event of a documented affair. It included a separate clause requiring Brielle to repay, in full, any marital funds she had moved or used in furtherance of an extramarital relationship. Phyllis had drafted that clause specifically because Phyllis had been doing this long enough to know what people do. The audio module had recorded 23 voice-activated events over the previous 14 months. Phyllis had transcripts of 9 of them. The transcripts established a clear timeline of Brielle's relationship with Carlton Royce, including specific conversations about Wilmington, the condo, and the $48,000 down payment that the bank loan was intended to fund. Combined with the fraudulent loan application, the bank statements showing the patterned withdrawals, and Yvonne's quiet documentation of Brielle's overnight absences cross-referenced against Carlton's Instagram check-ins, the file was, Phyllis said, the cleanest divorce posture I have built in a decade. And the loan? Garrett asked. He already knew. He just wanted to hear Desmond say it. Approved, Desmond said. Disbursed Friday. $48,000 into her personal account. Garrett smiled the smile of an old banker recognizing a maneuver he had seen used twice in his career, and only by men he respected. And she'll spend it. She'll spend it, Desmond agreed. She'll wire the down payment to Carlton's escrow account on Monday. Carlton will close on the Wilmington condo by the end of next week. The condo will be in her name. Because that was the whole arrangement, Carlton's credit can't carry it. By the time she realizes the loan is in her name only, the postnup is enforced, and the marital funds are subject to clawback, she will be holding a mortgage she cannot pay on a property tied to a man with a tax lien older than their relationship. Phyllis closed the folder. We file the petition Monday morning at 9. Yvonne hand delivers the certified packet to her at the dental office at 9:15. The joint accounts freeze at 9:16. By the time she gets in her car at lunch, she will have no joint funds, an enforceable postnup, a personal loan she cannot service, and a boyfriend who is about to discover the down payment came from a wife who is no longer a wife. Garrett took a long sip of his coffee. "Son," he said quietly, "your grandmother would be sitting in that chair smiling if she could see this room. You did it the way she taught you. Quiet, documented, lawful, no raised voice. No spectacle except the spectacle she will provide herself." Desmond nodded once. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled at this kind of work. He had not enjoyed building the file. He had only built it because the file had needed building, the way a foundation needed pouring before the house could stand. That afternoon, he drove out to Kinston to see his great-aunt Pearl, his grandmother's last living sister, 83 years old, and still keeping a porch garden in clay pots along her front railing. He sat in the rocker beside her and told her the short version of what was coming. Pearl listened without interrupting. When he was done, she patted his knee with a small dry hand and said, "Baby, your grandmother used to tell me a wise man never argues with a fool, because from a distance, people can't tell who's who. The wise man just lets the fool keep talking until everybody figures it out on their own." She paused. "You went and built yourself the kind of room where she'd have to keep talking. That's smart. That's your grandmother's smart. You go on and let her talk." He drove back to New Bern through the long, flat tobacco country and the falling light. And he thought about his grandmother, and he thought about how Brielle had spent 9 years mistaking his patience for poverty. And he thought about how the next 2 weeks were going to be the most carefully built 2 weeks of his life. Real power, he thought, operated in quiet rooms. Always had. Always would. Monday morning came clear and cold. Yvonne Hand delivered the certified packet to the dental office at 9:15 a.m. The joint accounts froze at 9:16. The loan had dispersed the previous Friday as scheduled. Brielle had wired the $48,000 to Carlton's escrow account that Saturday morning, exactly as Phyllis had predicted. And by Monday afternoon, the condo closing was a contractual freight train Brielle could no longer stop without forfeiting the money. She called Desmond 17 times between Monday morning and Tuesday afternoon. He did not answer. On Wednesday, his cousin Jerome, who happened to bank at Heritage and happened to be in the New Bern branch that afternoon, mentioned to Desmond afterward that Brielle had come into the lobby in tears and had asked the front desk if she could speak with the owner. The front desk had told her, very politely, that the owner was not available. The front desk had not been told to lie. The front desk had simply been told by Yvonne that Mrs. Vaughn was not to be put through to any executive without prior appointment. The reckoning happened in Phyllis Mott's conference room the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Phyllis had arranged it as a settlement conversation. Brielle had brought a divorce attorney she had retained on a credit card, a junior associate from a Greenville firm, 29 years old, visibly out of his depth before he sat down. Brielle wore the same suit she had worn to her cousin's funeral 2 years earlier. Carlton was not in the room. Carlton had stopped returning her calls on Friday, the same day the down payment cleared. Around the table sat Phyllis, Yvonne, Uncle Garrett, and Desmond. At the far end of the table sat Brielle's mother, Loretta, 66, retired postal worker, who had driven up from Wilson at Desmond's quiet invitation and who had not been told why until she arrived. Loretta had known Desmond for 9 years. She had liked him from the beginning. She had told her daughter, more than once, that she had married a good man and ought to learn how to recognize one. Loretta sat with her purse in her lap and her hands folded over it, and her mouth set in a line that meant she had a fair idea of what was coming and was not planning to interfere. Phyllis began the document drop at 10:04 a.m. and finished at 10:21 a.m. She laid out, one by one, the postnup with Brielle's signature in blue ink, the fidelity clause highlighted, the fraudulent loan application with the inflated income, the misrepresented assets, the false attestation, the wire record of the $48,000 transfer to Carlton's escrow account, the closing documents on the Wilmington condo, which was in Brielle's name only, the audio transcripts, the bank statements, the documentation of the 70% migration of joint funds to a separate account executed lawfully under Desmond's authority on the joint account, the timeline of 14 months. The junior associate from Greenville stopped writing on his legal pad somewhere around the postnup. By the time Phyllis got to the audio transcripts, he had put the pen down entirely. Then Uncle Garrett spoke for the first time. He spoke quietly, the way men who have been in banking for 40 years speak when the math has already done the arguing for them. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, "there is something you have apparently not been told. Your husband does not work operations for a real estate firm. Your husband owns the real estate firm. He also owns the bank that just disbursed your loan. He also owns 2 other community banks in eastern North Carolina. The full holding entity, audited as of last quarter, sits at $407 million in assets. None of it is in the marital estate, because the postnup you signed in 2019 specifically excluded it. The condominium in Wilmington is in your name. The loan is in your name. The fraud on the application is in your name. The man you intended to share the condominium with stopped answering your calls on Friday. I imagine you have figured out why." Brielle opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her mother. Loretta did not look back. "Mama," Brielle said. Her voice cracked. "Mama, please." "Brielle." Loretta did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice to her daughter in 40 years. "Sit there and listen. You have a good man across this table. You had a good man across this table for 9 years. You decided he was small because he was quiet. I told you. I told you the year you got engaged. I told you the Christmas before last when you started wearing that perfume. You did not listen to me. You will listen now." She turned her hands over in her lap. "Settle this woman's paperwork, Mr. Vaughn, then I am driving my daughter home, and she is going to figure out how she is going to live the rest of her life, and she is going to do it without my checkbook." The junior associate from Greenville cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Vaughn, I'd like to recommend we accept the terms as proposed. There is nothing here to contest." He looked at Phyllis with a kind of professional respect bordering on grief. Brielle began to cry. It was the second kind. The audience kind. "Desmond, baby, please. I made a mistake. We can fix this. We can. We built a life together." Desmond looked at his wife for what would be the last time across any table that mattered to either of them. He had not spoken in the meeting. He had not needed to. He spoke now, quietly, the way his grandmother had taught him a man speaks when the room has already done his work for him. "Brielle," he said, "I approved your loan because you were going to get it from somebody, and I would rather it had been from me. I dispersed it because you were going to spend it on him no matter who lent it to you. I let you sign the application because the application told the truth about you that 9 years of marriage could not get you to tell. I am not angry. I am clear. Those are different things. The papers will tell you the rest. Your mother will see you out." He stood. He buttoned his jacket, a plain dark suit jacket, the first time Brielle had ever seen him in one outside of a funeral. He paused beside Loretta's chair and laid a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Drive safe, Loretta. I'll have Yvonne send over anything Brielle needs from the house." Loretta nodded once without looking up. Desmond walked out of the conference room. He did not look back. Behind him, the door closed on a silence that would stay in Brielle's memory for the rest of her life. 10 months had passed like water. Desmond stood on the back porch of the brick ranch in New Bern at sunrise, coffee in one hand, the autumn settling over the small garden he had expanded the previous spring. He had not moved out of the house. He had decided, on the morning after the conference room, that the house had been his before Brielle and would remain his after her. And he was not going to surrender a single square foot of it to a memory that did not deserve it. He had repainted the bedroom. He had given the curtains away. He had bought a new mattress. The old dog from his uncle's farm slept in a patch of light by the kitchen door, gray at the muzzle now, content. First Carolina Heritage Bank had crossed $500 million in assets that summer. The result of a quiet acquisition of a fourth community bank in Edgecombe County. Desmond had used part of the proceeds to launch a small lending initiative for first-generation homebuyers in 3 eastern North Carolina counties, run out of a separate nonprofit arm in his grandmother's name. 41 families had closed on homes under the program so far. He attended every closing he could. He shook every hand. He told each of them what his grandmother had told him, the part about meeting the man first and letting the money introduce itself later. He had met Lenora Cates at one of those closings, a paralegal in Greenville, 39, a woman with a teenage son and a calm, steady way of asking questions that he had not realized he had been missing. She came to New Bern on Saturdays now. She walked the side yard with him. She asked good questions about the garden. She had asked him once what kind of work he did, and he had told her the short version, and she had nodded and said, "That sounds like a lot of responsibility." She had not asked again. The relationship was slow. Both of them preferred it that way. Brielle lived in a small apartment in Greenville. The Wilmington condo had been foreclosed on within 4 months of the closing because she could not service the mortgage on her dental office salary alone. The $48,000 loan from First Carolina Heritage remained on her credit report, and she was repaying it on a 15-year schedule. The clawback provision in the postnup had compelled her to repay an additional $61,000 in misdirected marital funds, a payment plan that would run into her early 50s. She had lost her part-time job at the dental office 4 months in, after the office manager, a woman who happened to attend the same church as Yvonne, had quietly suggested it was time to move on. She worked now as a receptionist at a chiropractor's office off Memorial Drive. Carlton Royce had filed for personal bankruptcy in the spring. The ears lean had finally caught him. He had moved back to Charlotte to live with a cousin. The fitness brand was gone. Desmond heard each piece of news through his uncle Garrett, who heard it through people, who heard it through other people, the way news travels in eastern North Carolina. He registered each piece. He moved on. He did not gloat. Gloating, his grandmother used to say, was a tax on your own future. Brielle's mother, Loretta, had taken to driving down to New Bern once a month to have lunch with Desmond. The first time she had come, 4 months after the conference room, she had brought a chess pie and said, "I owe you nothing, son, but I owe myself the dignity of treating a good man the way a good man ought to be treated. I'd like to come around sometimes, if that's all right." Desmond had told her she was welcome any time. She had been welcome ever since. That morning he set his coffee on the porch rail and walked out to the garden. Lenora was driving in at noon. Uncle Garrett was coming the following Saturday. He knelt at the base of the small fig tree he had planted in his grandmother's memory the previous spring and pressed a handful of compost into the soil with the same care she had shown him in her own backyard 50 years before. A cardinal landed on the fence post and watched him for a moment and lifted away. The morning was clean. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. Money, his grandmother had said, was the loudest thing a quiet man could carry, and the trick was to set it down before you walked into a room. He had set it down for 9 years. He had picked it up exactly one time, on a Tuesday afternoon in a bank lobby, and he had set it down again, and he did not plan to pick it up loudly ever again. He had built everything worth keeping, and most of it nobody would ever see, and that was exactly the way it was supposed to be. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.